This is where the line broke. My father's regiment was positioned here. They never stood a chance.
Seeing this place, I just don't understand how they survived. I can't do this.
There is a photograph that sits on a mantelpiece in a house in Ohio. The man in the photograph is 23 years old and wearing the uniform of the United States Army and smiling with the specific smile of a young man who had been asked to hold still for a camera. He looks happy. He looks ordinary. He looks like every other young man in every other uniform photograph taken in every other American town in 1943. The woman who keeps the photograph on the mantelpiece is 81 years old. She has kept it there since 1945. She is the man's daughter. She has never spoken to him. She never will. Her father shipped out to the Pacific in the spring of 1944. She was born in October that year, 6 months after he left. He never knew she existed. The letter telling him about the pregnancy was still in transit when his ship was sunk in the Philippine Sea. The letter was returned to her mother, marked undeliverable. She kept it in the box with the other letters. She kept the box until she died. Then the daughter found it. The daughter was 47 years old when she found the box. She was a grown woman with children of her own, with a career and a marriage and a life that she had built entirely without the father who had died before she was born. She had grown up with a photograph on the mantelpiece, and with her mother's stories about a man she could not fully describe because she had only known him for 2 years before the war took him. She had grown up with a specific absence at the center of her life, the specific shaped absence of a father-size hole that no one had ever been able to fill, and that she had learned to carry so naturally that it had become invisible even to herself. She opened the box at the kitchen table in the house she had grown up in the afternoon after her mother's funeral, and she spent the next 6 hours reading letters from a man she had never met. This is the story of the children who grew up without fathers because the war took the fathers before the children were born, or when the children were too young to remember, or when the children were old enough to remember but not old enough to understand. It is a story of the specific shaped absence that is different from every other kind of loss because it is a loss of something that was never present. The loss of the possible, the loss of the version of your life that would have existed if the specific man in the specific uniform photograph had come home. Before I tell you these stories, I want to ask directly if this series is reaching you. If the part of the war that the history books don't cover is giving you something, subscribe and hit the like button. The algorithm needs that signal. And share this with someone who grew up with a photograph on a mantelpiece and a box of letters they haven't opened yet. This story is for them. The specific ways that growing up without a father shaped the identities of the children of the fallen is something that the oral histories reveal in patterns that are consistent enough to suggest a shared experience beneath the individual variation. Many of them describe a specific quality of self-sufficiency that developed early, the specific capability of a child who has learned to manage their emotional life without the resource of a father who has learned that certain needs cannot be met in the conventional way and who has found alternative ways to meet them. This self-sufficiency was an adaptation to the absence, and it served them well in many respects. It also sometimes made it harder for them to accept help when help is available or to be fully present in intimate relationships, in the specific way that people who have learned early to manage alone sometimes find it difficult to allow others fully in. Many of them describe a specific quality of attention to the fathers around them, to the fathers of their friends, to the men who served as informal father figures in their lives, to the specific behavior of fathers in public spaces. They noticed fathers. They studied them. They were learning, in the specific way of children who lack access to first-hand model, what fathers were like, what they did, how they moved, what the relationship looked like from the outside. The specific fathers they observed through this attention shaped their understanding of what fatherhood was in ways that the absent father could not. The grandfather often played a specific role in these families, stepping into the space the father had left, providing the male presence and the specific mentorship that the mother alone could not provide. The specific relationships between fatherless children and their grandfathers are some of the most moving in the oral history of the period. The old man who taught the boy to fish or build things or to navigate the world. the specific transmission of the practical and emotional knowledge that normally passes from father to son, rerouted through the generation above. Some of the grandfathers had themselves served in the First World War, and the specific quality of the relationship between the veteran grandfather and the son, who grew up fatherless because of the next war, had a particular resonance. The older man who had survived one war, now the primary male figure for the child whose father had not survived the next one. The specific knowledge that the grandfather carried of what war was, of what it cost, of what required the men who survived it, was available to the grandchild in a form that was indirect but real. There was a boy named Thomas. The same Thomas from the first episode, the baby who reached out to the weeping man on the front steps, now grown, who had a specific relationship with his maternal grandfather that he described as the closest thing to a father relationship he had in his early years. His grandfather had served in the First World War and had come home with the specific quality of a man who had seen things that he did not speak about, and who had therefore, in a way, prepared Thomas for the specific quality of the silence that his own father would have carried if his father had come home. Thomas's grandfather taught him to drive and to fish and to maintain a house. He taught him specific practical things, and he also taught him, through the specific quality of his presence, something about what it means to be a man who has been through difficult things and who continues to show up anyway. He died when Thomas was 17, and Thomas described his death as the most significant loss of his childhood, more significant in its felt impact, though not in its meaning, than the loss of the father he had never known. The specific deaths of these grandfather substitutes, the men who had stepped into the fatherless spaces and provided what the fathers could not provide, were secondary losses in the lives of the children of the fallen, and they compounded the original loss in ways that the children sometimes found overwhelming. The boy who had already lost a father he never knew and who then lost a grandfather who had been a father in practice was a boy who was learning, through painful repetition, the specific lesson that the people who fill the space can also be taken. Some of them became, in their adult lives, specifically attentive fathers themselves, men who had grown up knowing what fatherlessness was and who were determined to ensure that their own children knew what fatherfulness was. They were, in many cases, unusually present fathers, unusually attentive, unusually deliberate, unusually aware of the specific value of the ordinary daily presence that the war had denied them. They had grown up understanding, from the inside, what the absence of father cost a child, and they had decided that their own children would not know that cost. The specific irony of this is that some of them, in their determination to be present for their children, brought with them the specific emotional patterns that the fatherlessness had produced, the self-sufficiency that became emotional distance, the hypervigilance about loss that became overprotectiveness, the specific difficulty with vulnerability that the early management of an unmet need had created. They were present in ways their own fathers could not be. They were also shaped by the absence in ways that their presence could not fully address. The children who grew up with these attentive butt-shaped fathers had their own specific experience of the war's long reach, the second-generation effect of the fatherlessness, visible now not as absence, but as a specific quality of a presence that was shaped by an original absence. The war reached forward through the generations in this specific way, producing specific patterns in families that were 3 and 4 generations removed from the original loss. This is the full scale of what the war cost. Not simply the men who died, not simply the immediate families who received the news, but the specific families that were shaped by the loss across generations, the children who grew up without fathers and the children they had, and the specific emotional inheritance they passed on. The photograph is on the mantelpiece. The letters are in the box. The daughter found the box at 47. The son stood in the forest in Belgium and called home. The teacher taught Monte Cassino for 30 years and told the story of the man who climbed the hill. These are the specific people. These are the specific ways the war continued after 1945. These are the specific costs that don't appear in the casualty figures, but that were paid, generation after generation, by the families of the men who did not come home. The father died in the war. The child grew up without him. The child made a life anyway, sometimes a remarkable life, sometimes a difficult life, always a life shaped by the specific hole at its center. And somewhere in a house, on a mantelpiece or in a box in the attic, the photograph waits for the next time someone needs to look at it. The young man in the uniform, 23 years old, smiling for camera, ordinary, extraordinary, gone. The child grew up and found the letters and met him at last. Late, not enough. Everything. That is the story. That is the sons and daughters who grew up without fathers from the war. That is the full accounting of what the war cost the children it left behind. There is a specific kind of grief that the children who grew up without fathers developed a specific relationship to, a grief that was not quite grief in a conventional sense because it was not the grief of losing something you had. It was the grief of a possibility, the grief of the version of your life that was foreclosed before it began. This distinction matters because the conventional language of grief, the stages, the timeline, the specific expectation that grief resolves and becomes manageable over time, does not fully apply to the grief of an absence that was present from the beginning. A child who grows up without a father does not lose a father in the moment of the father's death. The child inherits the loss at birth. The loss is not an event in the child's life. It is a condition of the child's life. It is present in every school play where the other children have two parents in the audience and the child has one. It is present at every father-daughter dance that the child does not attend. It is present in every conversation about fathers that requires the specific navigation to the question, what does your dad do? And the specific response that the child eventually develops to answer it. The specific responses that children of fallen soldiers develop to this question. The various ways of saying my father died in the war that the culture of the period made available were a specific form of social script that these children learned early and carried throughout their lives. The script was not dishonest. The father had died in the war, but the script was also incomplete. It described the fact of the absence without capturing the specific texture of living with it, the specific ways that the absence shaped everything about who the child became. The research on children raised without fathers, whether through death, absence, or desertion, documents specific developmental effects that the period's understanding did not have the framework to predict or address. Children raised without fathers are, on average, more likely to experience certain kinds of difficulties in specific areas of emotional regulation, in specific patterns of relationship attachment, in specific vulnerabilities to depression and anxiety than children raised with two parents. The specific mechanisms by which the father's absence produces these effects are complex and still debated, but the effect itself is well documented. What the research also documents is the specific resilience that many children raised without fathers develop, the specific capabilities that the challenge of the absence produces, the ways in which growing up with less can build specific strengths. The children of fallen soldiers who thrived, who built full and meaningful lives, who became good parents themselves, who found ways to honor the father they never knew while also living fully in the present, were often the ones who had found specific ways to make the absence productive, to use the photographs and the letters not simply as artifacts of grief, but as resources for understanding. A specific way that knowing who your father was can tell you something important about who you are. There was a daughter I want to tell you about. I will call her Frances, whose father was killed at Monte Cassino in 1944. She was 4 years old when he died. She had specific memories of him. Not many, not detailed, but specific. The smell of his coat, the specific quality of his laugh, the way he would lift her up and hold her at shoulder height so that she was at eye level with the adults. These memories were precious to her, and she knew they were imprecise. She could not be certain how much of what she remembered was actual memory and how much was the reconstruction of a story she had been told so many times that it had become indistinguishable from the direct experience. She grew up with her mother and her maternal grandparents, and the specific shape of her childhood was defined by the war's absence in the specific way of a child who is old enough to remember the present, but young enough that the memory is more feeling than fact. She knew something had been taken. She did not have the full account of what. She spent her adult life as a teacher. She taught history, specifically the Second World War, for 31 years in a high school in Connecticut. She taught the battles and the commanders and the strategic decisions, and she taught them well with the specific knowledge of someone who had spent decades understanding them. And every year, on the day she taught Monte Cassino, she told her students the story of her father, not the heroic version, the specific version, the version where he was 26 years old and had a 4-year-old daughter at home, and he went up a hill in Italy and did not come back down. She told them what the letters said about who he was, the specific person, the teacher and the baseball player and the man who laughed at his own jokes and who wrote to his wife about the smell of the Italian countryside because he thought she would appreciate the beauty of it even in a war zone. She told her students this because she had learned, over 30 years of teaching the war, that the specific human being behind the statistics was the thing that made the history real. That the number 405,000 did not mean anything until you knew one of the people it contained. That the Battle of Monte Cassino was not only a military operation, but also the specific place where a specific man with a specific daughter at home climbed a hill and died, and that the specific daughter had gone on to teach the battle for 30 years and to tell the story of the man whose loss had shaped her life. Her students remembered the story. Some of them came back to tell her so, years after they had left her class, that they had thought about her father when they visited a war memorial, or when they read a news story about soldiers in a modern conflict, or when they had children of their own and thought about what it would mean to leave them. The specific human story that Frances told had done what the statistics could not do. It made the war real, and the making real had stayed with the people who heard it. This is part of what the children of the fallen soldiers gave the world, alongside the specific grief they carried. They gave the human scale. They were the people for whom the abstract number had a face and a laugh, and a way of lifting a daughter to shoulder height. They were the people for whom the strategic decision to send troops to Monte Cassino meant a specific thing. The specific 4-year-old girl who would spend the next 30 years teaching that battle and telling that story. The war produced millions of these people. Hundreds of thousands of children who grew up with photographs on mantelpieces and boxes in attics and specific shaped absences at the centers of their lives. They are the custodians of a specific kind of historical knowledge. The knowledge of what the war cost at the level of the individual life, the family, the child who never met the father. Some of them have written memoirs. Some of them have given oral history interviews. Some of them have simply carried the story inside themselves and told it to their own children, who have carried it further. The specific chain of transmission, from the dead father to the motherless daughter to the grandchildren who heard the story and will tell it to their own children, is a specific form of historical memory that the official records do not capture, and that is in danger of being lost as the generations who carry it age and die. The photographs will remain. The letters, if they have been preserved, will remain. The specific human knowledge of what it was like to be the child who grew up with a photograph on a mantelpiece, that knowledge is leaving the world as the last of these children age and die, and the full accounting of the war's cost requires preserving it before it goes. Frances retired from teaching in 2003. She died in 2018 at 78 years old. The specific students she had taught, the specific people who had heard the story of the man who climbed a hill in Italy and did not come back, carry it forward now. It is in the world because she put it there. She put it there because her father had died in the war, and she had found a way to make the death mean something. That is what the children of the fallen did with the specific loss the war gave them. They made it mean something. They taught it, or wrote it, or told it to their children, or stood in the forest in Belgium and wept and called home. The father died. The child lived. The child made the death mean something. That is enough. That is the full accounting. The specific scale of the fatherlessness that the Second World War produced is difficult to calculate precisely because the specific statistics of children born after a soldier's death or the soldiers who died before their children were old enough to remember them were not systematically compiled. What is known is that approximately 405,000 Americans died in the war, and that a significant proportion of them were young men of childbearing age who had wives and families at home. The specific number of children who grew up without fathers because the war killed their fathers before or shortly after they were born is estimated in the hundreds of thousands. These children grew up in a specific cultural context that did not have a language for what they were experiencing. The culture of the post-war period honored the sacrifice of the fallen, the Gold Star families, the memorials, the specific institutional acknowledgement of the debt owed to the dead. But it did not have a language for the specific psychological experience of growing up with an absent father who was absent not through choice or abandonment, but through the specific form of death that comes from a war. The grief of these children was a specific kind of grief. Not the grief of loss, exactly, because you cannot lose what you never had, but something adjacent to grief, something for which the available language was inadequate. Some of them grew up knowing almost everything there was to know about the father. Mothers who kept the letters and the photographs and the military records, who told the stories, who maintained the relationship with the father's family, so that the children had grandparents and aunts and uncles who carried the specific memories of the person who had been taken. Some of them grew up knowing very little. mothers who were too damaged by the loss to speak about it, who put away the photographs and did not take them out, who built the specific wall around the grief that grief sometimes requires, and that children sometimes end up on the outside of. The specific quality of the knowing was different from the specific quality of the having known. A child who grows up hearing stories about her father, who is told about the way he laughed, the specific things he loved, the particular quality of his presence in a room, knows her father in a way that is real and specific and meaningful. She also knows him in a way that is fundamentally different from the knowing that comes from actual proximity, from the specific ordinary knowledge of a person that accumulates through the 10,000 ordinary interactions of shared daily life. The stories are not the person. The photograph is not the father. The knowing built from secondhand accounts is a real thing, but it is a different thing from the knowing that the war prevented. This distinction between the knowing from stories and the knowing from presence is one that the children who grew up without fathers understood from the inside, without always having the words for it. They knew the outline. They did not know the person. The letters changed this when they were found. For the children who eventually came into possession of their father's wartime letters, through their mother's deaths, through the opening of boxes that had been kept closed for decades, through the specific research that some of them undertook when they were old enough to want to know, the experience of reading the letters was described by person after person in the same terms. It was the first time they met their father. The letters that soldiers wrote home from the Second World War are some of the most remarkable documents of the period, and their specific quality as historical artifacts is inseparable from their specific quality as personal documents, the specific voice of a specific person, preserved in the specific moment of the specific thought, on paper that has lasted for 80 years, and that still carries a particular quality of that person's way of being in the world. A father writing to his pregnant wife in the Pacific in 1944 is writing in a specific register, the specific combination of tenderness and restraint that the masculine culture of the period required, the specific effort to communicate across the enormous distance of the Pacific War without either alarming or burdening the person waiting at home. He is managing his own fear and his own exhaustion and his own specific engagement with the reality of what he is doing while simultaneously trying to maintain a connection to the domestic life he has left and may not return to. The specific quality of this management, the specific ways that the real feeling breaks through restraint or is visible around the edges of the restraint, is the specific human content of the letters that the children found in the boxes. There was a man named Edward, the father of the woman with the Ohio photograph, the man who died in the Philippine Sea before he knew his daughter existed. His letters home to his wife had been written over 2 years, from his training in the United States through the Pacific Campaign, and they told a story of a person that his daughter spent the afternoon after her mother's funeral reading with the specific intensity of a woman who has been waiting her entire life for this information without knowing that she was waiting. Edward had been funny. This was the first thing his daughter noticed. The specific humor that ran through the letters, the particular way he described the people and places around him with the affectionate absurdity that the military environment seemed to produce in him. He had been tender. He had written to his wife with the specific tenderness of a man who was fully aware that the distance and the danger made ordinary tenderness feel insufficient, and who was trying to say more than ordinary language aloud. He had been afraid, not explicitly. The specific restraint of the period would not have allowed an explicit statement of fear, but it was visible in the letters, in the specific ways that his attention to the ordinary details of home life became more intense as the campaign became more dangerous, as if he was holding those details more tightly, because he could feel the possibility of losing them. His daughter read these letters and understood, for the first time, who the man in the photograph was, not the uniform and the smile and the formal pose of the mantelpiece image. The person, the specific person who was funny and tender and afraid, and who died in a sea that is very far from Ohio before he knew that she existed. She wept, not simply from grief, though there was grief, but from the specific overwhelming experience of meeting someone you have been looking for your entire life, and discovering that the meeting is the same thing as a farewell. She was meeting her father for the first time at the same moment that she was understanding that she would never meet him. The letters were the only meeting that was possible. She received them at the kitchen table, alone, 47 years after he died. And they were enough, and they were not enough, and she was grateful for them. The specific experience of this meeting through letters has been described by many of the children of fallen soldiers. The specific combination of grief and gratitude, of gain and loss occurring simultaneously, of the specific person finally becoming real at the moment when real contact is permanently foreclosed. It is one of the more remarkable human experiences that the war produced, and it is one that has been largely invisible in the official history of the conflict. The invisible history of the Second World War, the history that happened inside the households and the hearts of the people left behind, is the history this series is trying to tell. The battles have been described. The commanders have been analyzed. The strategies have been assessed. The specific experience of the child who grew up with a photograph on the mantelpiece and opened a box of letters at 47 and spent the afternoon meeting the father she never had. That experience is as real as any battle, and it is as much a consequence of the war as any strategic outcome. There was a son I want to tell you about. I will call him William. He was born in March 1945. 2 months before the war in Europe ended, to a father who had been killed in the Battle of the Bulge in January of that year. His father had been 24 years old. His mother had been 22. They had been married for 14 months when he shipped out. William grew up knowing his father through 3 specific things: the photographs, the letters, and the medal. The medal was a Bronze Star, awarded posthumously for specific action in which his father had died. The specific act of covering the withdrawal of his unit at the cost of his own life that the citation described in the formal language of military commendation. William had read the citation so many times that he had memorized it. He carried the medal in his pocket on specific occasions: his first day of high school, his wedding, the day his own son was born. He became, over the course of his life, an expert on the Battle of the Bulge, not the general history, though he knew the general history thoroughly, but the specific part of the battle that his father had been in. He had read every account, studied every map, corresponded with other survivors of the same unit, visited the battlefield twice. He had reconstructed, as completely as the records allowed, the specific sequence of events on a specific day in January 1945, when his father made the specific decision that the medal described. He was not doing this out of grief. Exactly. He described it differently, as a specific project of a man who had been raised by a woman who loved someone who was not there, who had grown up understanding that the shape of his entire life had been determined by the specific decision of a specific man in a specific moment, in a specific forest in Belgium, and who needed to understand that moment as completely as the historical record allowed. He needed to know what his father saw. He needed to know the specific terrain, and the specific conditions, and the specific situation. He needed to understand what the decision looked like from the inside. What a 24-year-old man thinks about in the moment, he decides to stay behind so that the others can withdraw. Not because understanding it would change anything, because the decision was the most important thing his father had ever done, and because his father was the most important absent person in his life, and because the specific act of understanding it was the closest thing to knowing the man that the circumstances allowed. He described the battlefield visit. The first time he stood in the specific forest where his father had died, with a specificity that has stayed with me. He said that he had stood in the trees and looked at the specific terrain and thought about the specific cold of the Belgian winter in January 1945, and about the specific sound of the battle, and about the specific young man, his father, his age now, younger than his own children would eventually be, who had stood in roughly the same place and made the specific decision that ended his life and made Williams possible. He had wept. He had not expected to weep. He was a man in his 60s, a composed and practical person, not given to public emotion. He had stood in the forest and wept for the 24-year-old man who had died in it, and for the 14-month marriage that was all his parents had had, and for the mother who had raised him alone, and for the life that the decision of the forest had made impossible, and the life it had made possible simultaneously. He wept for all of it in the trees and the cold, 60 years after it happened. Then he went back to his hotel and called his son. The specific call he made his son from a hotel in Belgium, the day he visited the battlefield, is a specific image I carry from William's story. He called his son to tell him where he was and what he had seen. He called him because the specific experience of standing in the place where his father had died had made him need to hear the voice of his own child. The specific connection between the death in the forest and the birth that followed it and the life that followed the birth and the son who was the next link in the chain was fully visible to him in that moment, and he needed to reach across it. His son answered. William told him where he was. His son said, "I know, Dad. You've told me about it." William said yes. I just wanted to hear your voice. That is the story of the sons who grew up without fathers because the war took the fathers. Not the simple story of loss and grief, though there is loss and grief. The story of the specific shaped absence, and the letters found in boxes, and the battlefield visits, and the phone calls from hotels in Belgium, and the specific human project of knowing a person across the distance that death creates. The photograph is on the mantelpiece. The box is in the attic. The letters are in the box. And the child who grew up without the father carries a father anyway. In the photograph and the letters in the metal, and the specific act of standing in a forest in Belgium, and weeping and then calling home. That is the full accounting. That is what the war caused to children who never met the fathers it took. The specific moment when a child or fallen soldier first understood, truly understood, not intellectually but emotionally, what had been taken from them is a moment that many of them describe as occurring later than you might expect. Not in childhood, when the loss was present but not fully comprehensible. Not in adolescence, when the loss became more visible in the specific ways that adolescence amplifies what is missing. But in adulthood, often in the specific moments of adulthood that fathers are supposed to be present for. The first day of high school, the wedding, the day their own child was born. These were the moments when the absence became fully visible. When the specific thing that a father is supposed to be there for arrived, and the father was not there, and the child who had been living with the absence for decades suddenly felt it with the specific sharpness of something new. A daughter who had grown up without the father killed at Anzio described the day her own daughter was born as the day she understood what she had lost. She had known, abstractly, her whole life that her father was dead, but holding her own newborn, feeling the specific overwhelming love that new parents feel, the specific protective terror of a person who has just been entrusted with life. She thought about her father holding her mother's first child, which was herself, and she understood for the first time what her father had felt in that moment. And she understood that it felt it and then gone to war and died, and that the war had taken not just a life, but a specific love that she had just, for the first time, understood. She wept. Her husband held her and thought she was weeping from joy. She was weeping from both, from the specific simultaneous experience of receiving something and understanding what had been taken at the same moment. This is the specific quality of the loss that the children of the fallen carry, the way it becomes most vivid at the moments of greatest fullness, the way the understanding of what was taken arrives at precisely the moments when you most understand its value. The birth of a child, the graduation, the wedding. The father is supposed to be there for these moments, and the father is not there. And the not being there is felt most sharply at the moments when you most understand why being there matters. There was a son named Robert who had grown up without the father killed in the Pacific. He had become in his adult life a successful engineer, a good husband, a devoted father to 3 children of his own. He had, by most measures, built a full and good life. He had not dwelled on the father he had never known. Not obsessively, not in ways that interfered with the living of his life. He had carried the absence the way you carry a scar, present, occasionally painful when touched, mostly just part of the background of who you are. And then his eldest son graduated from college. Robert sat in the stadium with his wife and his other children and watched his son walk across the stage to receive his diploma. And something happened to him that he had not expected. He thought about his own father. He thought about the specific pride that a father feels at a moment like this, the specific emotion of watching the person you have raised achieve something significant, the specific satisfaction of having contributed to the making of that moment. And he understood that his father had never felt this, had never sat in a stadium and watched a child graduate, had never had the specific experience of raising a person to adulthood and seeing them step out into the world. He had died in the Pacific at 26. He had not lived to have a son who graduated from college. He had not lived to have grandchildren. He had not lived past the specific beginning of what his life was supposed to be. Robert sat in the stadium with his diploma and cried. His son came to find him afterward and asked what was wrong, and Robert told him about the grandfather who had died in the Pacific before Robert was born, told him about the absence he had carried his whole life, told him that today he understood it differently than he ever had before. His son listened. Then he said, "I think he would have been proud of you, Dad. Not just of me, of you." Robert said that was the most important thing anyone had said to him in his adult life. The specific gift that the children of the fallen sometimes received, the specific gift of being told that the absent father would have been proud, was a gift that arrived from unexpected places, from the mother who knew the father and could speak for him, from the grandfather who had known him and could describe him, from the son who had never met the grandfather but who understood, from the love of the father he had grown up with, what the love of a grandfather would have felt like, the transmission of the pride across the absence through the people who could speak it. That was one of the specific human acts of repair that the families of the fallen performed. They could not bring the father back. They could carry forward, as specifically as possible, the specific qualities of the person who was gone, so that the children who never met him could receive, at second hand, some fraction of what the presents would have given. The letters were part of this. The stories were part of this. The grandfather substitutes and the family friends and the comrades who had served with the father and who came sometimes to tell the child what the father had been like, they were all part of this. The specific project of keeping the absent father present enough that the child could grow up with something rather than nothing. The something was not everything. It was never everything. But it was real and it mattered. And the children who received it carried it forward and gave it to their own children. And the specific human chain of transmitted memory and love reached forward from the specific deaths in the specific places across the specific decades. The father died in the war. The child grew up with a photograph on the mantelpiece. The child made a life. The child told the story to their own children. And somewhere in the chain of transmission, the person who was gone became real again. Specific and particular and known. The people who never met him and will never meet him through the specific love of the people who did. That is the full accounting. That is the sons and daughters of the Second World War's fallen. That is what the war cost them and what they did with the cost. The specific cultural moment we are now in, the moment when the last people with direct memory of the Second World War are dying, when the children of the fallen soldiers are themselves in their 80s and 90s, when the specific human knowledge of what the war cost at the individual level is passing from living memory into the archive, makes the telling of these stories urgent in a specific way, there will come a time, not very far from now, when there is no one left alive who grew up with the absence. The last daughter who sat at the kitchen table and opened the box of letters will die. The last son who stood in the forest in Belgium and wept will die. The specific living memory of what it was like to be the child who grew up without the father the war took. That will pass with them. What will remain is the archive. The photographs on the mantelpieces, the letters in the boxes, the military records, the oral history interviews that some of these people gave to universities and museums and libraries in the years before they died. The specific human knowledge of the loss will pass from living experience to historical record. And the historical record, however carefully assembled, does not carry the specific weight of the lived thing. This is one of the reasons these stories need to be told now, not simply because they are important, but because the people who carry them in the most direct form are still alive, and the telling while they are alive is different from the telling after they are gone. The daughter who tells you what it was like to open the box of letters is different from the granddaughter who tells you what her grandmother told her about opening the box. Both are valuable. Only one has a specific weight of the direct experience. The history of the Second World War has been told many times, in many forms, at many levels of scale. The battles have been described in forensic detail. The commanders have been analyzed from every angle. The strategies and the weapons and the logistics and the intelligence have all been given the attention they deserve. The children who grew up with photographs on mantelpieces have not been given the attention they deserve. They are the living evidence of what the war cost at the level that matters most, the level of the individual life, the family, the child who grew up shaped by an absence that had no name and no address and no end. They are the specific human cost of the specific decisions that the specific commanders made in the specific battles that the specific historians have described. They are also the custodians of a specific form of love, the love of the child for the parent they never met, the love maintained across the distance that death creates, the specific human act of honoring a person you never knew by carrying their memory into the present. This love is real. It is a form of love that the war invented, by creating the specific conditions in which it was the only form available. The photograph is on the mantelpiece. The letters are in the box. The daughter sat at the kitchen table and met her father at 47. The son stood in the Belgian forest and called his own son. The teacher taught Monte Cassino for 30 years and told the story of a man who climbed the hill. These are the specific acts of love that the children of the fallen performed. These are the specific ways they honored the people they never knew. These are the full lives they built in the shadow of the specific shaped absence, and the ways they made the absence mean something. The father died in the war. The child lived and made a life. The life contained both the loss and the love. Subscribe if you haven't, and share this with someone who carries a story like this. The children of the war's fallen deserve to be known, and their stories deserve to be heard before the last of them are gone. That is the full accounting. That is the sons and daughters who grew up without fathers from the war. There is one more story. It is the story of a woman named Catherine, who was not the child of a fallen soldier, but the sister of one. She was 17 when her brother went to war, and 19 when he was killed in France in 1944. She spent the next 60 years of her life as the keeper of his memory, the person in the family who maintained the photographs and the letters and the specific knowledge of who he had been. She never married. Not because she chose not to. She had been engaged once in the early 1950s, but the engagement had ended. She lived alone in a house she had grown up in a town in rural Pennsylvania, and she taught school for 35 years. And she was by all accounts a full and good life, a person who was loved and who loved, who was part of her community and her family, and who was not defined simply by the loss she carried. But the loss was always there. Her brother's room in the house remained as it had been. His baseball glove on the shelf, his textbooks from high school, the photographs on the dresser. She did not keep the room as a shrine. It was a practical space, used for storage, visited by her in the ordinary way of someone who lives in a house with multiple rooms. But it was still in the specific way that a space remains a space of a person who will never return to it. His children came to visit her. When he died, he had been engaged but not married, had no children. But his brother had children, and the children of that brother were the closest thing to his children that the family had. Catherine was their aunt, and she was also, specifically, the person who most fully carried the memory of the uncle they had never met. She told them stories, not the heroic stories, not the military version of his death, the formal account of the battle and the specific medal that was awarded posthumously, the ordinary stories, the way he had cheated at cards, the summer when he worked at the county fair and came home smelling of livestock every night, the specific argument he had with their father about baseball that became a family joke that was still being told 30 years later, the specific human stories that made him real rather than mythological. The children absorbed these stories. They asked for them again and again in the specific way of children who are assembling a person from second-hand accounts and who need the pieces repeated so that the assembly can be done correctly. Catherine gave the stories gladly, understanding that she was performing a specific function, the transmission of a person across the distance that death creates, the making real of someone who would otherwise be only a name on a casualty list. She died in 2001 at 75. At her funeral, her nephews and nieces spoke about what she had given them. They spoke about the stories. They spoke about the specific gift of knowing, through Catherine, who the uncle they had never met had been, the card cheater, the fair worker, the baseball arguer, the young man who had gone to France in 1944 and not come home. One of them said something that I have carried since I heard it. She kept him alive for us, not literally. She knew he was dead, and she was honest about what death meant. But she kept a specific person alive in the specific form of the stories, and she gave those stories to the next generation, and the next generation will give them to the next. The father dies. The child grows up without him. Someone, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, a comrade who served with him, keeps the specific person alive in the specific form of the stories. The stories reach the children. The children reach their children. The specific person, reduced now to the specific stories, reaches forward through the decades. This is the form that immortality takes for the ordinary men who died in the ordinary places of the ordinary war. Not the great men and the great battles and the great monuments. The specific men and the specific stories, kept alive by the specific love of the people who knew them and who could not stop knowing them. The father died in the war. The child grew up without him. The stories were kept. The stories were told. The person reached forward. That is enough. That is everything. That is the full accounting of the sons and daughters who grew up without fathers from the war. The specific question I want to leave you with is the one that I think lives at the center of all these stories. What do you owe the dead? Not in the abstract, not in a large philosophical sense of what we owe the people who sacrificed for our freedom, the specific public debt that the memorials and the ceremonies and the moment of silence are designed to acknowledge, in the specific personal sense. What do you owe the specific person who died before you were born, or when you were too young to remember, who shaped your life through their absence in ways that you have spent your whole life trying to understand? The children of the fallen soldiers answered this question in different ways. Some of them answered it through the research, the letters, the battle histories, the visits to the places where the father had been. Some of them answered it through the teaching, the telling of the stories, the specific act of keeping the person real for the next generation. Some of them answered it through the living, through the specific choice to build the best life available in the specific circumstances the loss had created, as a form of honor to the person who had died, so that the life could be possible. There is no single right answer to what you owe the dead. There is only the specific answer that each specific person arrives at through the specific experience of their specific loss. The daughter who opened the box of letters at 47. The son who stood in the Belgian forest. The teacher who told the story of Monte Cassino for 30 years. They each found the specific answer that their specific situation required. What they shared was a specific refusal to let the death be only a death, the specific insistence that the person who was gone be also a person who was known, as fully as the circumstances allowed, by the people who came after him. The specific act of making the dead real is a specific form of love that the children of the fallen gave to the fathers they never had. The photograph is on the mantelpiece. The young man is 23 years old and smiling for camera. He went to the Pacific in 1944 and did not come back. His daughter is 81 years old, and she has kept the photograph for 60 years, and she will keep it until she dies, and then her children will decide what to do with it. She knows who he is now. She found the letters. She spent an afternoon meeting him at 47. She knows the specific things he loved and the specific way he laughed and the specific tender fear that ran through his letters as the campaign became more dangerous. She knows him. He is gone. She has him anyway, in the form that the letters allow. That is what the war left behind in the houses where the fathers did not come home. The letters, the photographs, the stories, the specific shaped absence that taught the children who grew up in it something about loss and love that the history books do not contain. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who carries this story. It deserves to be heard. The father died in the war. The child made a life. The life was shaped by the loss and illuminated by the love. That is the full accounting.